nice things to me, and they enjoy the process and enjoy the project that's being done, and so that part of it's fun. Okay, first thing I gotta do is get your first and last name. So Philip H. Schmidt, but you go by Skip.
Right.
Okay. One thing that I didn't know was where actually were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was in school down in California. In a school I was doing, I was in my senior year, I believe it was. It was, yeah, the senior year.
So you were still in high school?
I was still in high school in 1941, and then I graduated that spring in 42. Yeah. We were there, and we thought that in the school there was supposed to be no arms whatsoever, like we have today. And you'd never seen so many arms. Guns and pistols and machetes and things came out from underneath. It was a boarding school, underneath the beds. And we were sure that this one janitor was a Japanese spy. And we were ready to protect everything. But yeah, it was pretty scary, because we were right there just south of San Francisco at Menlo Park.
Down at Menlo.
Yeah, right next to Stanford.
So, so when that happened, being in high school, obviously it was a real serious concern.
Yes, scared the piss out of everybody.
So they were being 19, I guess 18 years old, roughly 19, something like that. Did you think at that time that you were going to become involved in this war, or was
Oh yeah, and I knew I was going to be involved, and and the other thing was is we did all the preparation of the school. We did all the things that you need to do to protect the school, evacuation, all of those things. You know, we had guard duties. It was really a very scary time for everybody.
So even in high school, you were basically military ready, so to speak.
Well, I don't know about military ready, but we were all thinking that we're going to be going into the war one way or another. Whether we're going to wait and let the draft take care of us, or whether we're going to try to get in a certain end of the service, or what. Yeah. And of course, our parents were saying, "Don't do anything. don't rush.
Don't rush. Don't join up."
Yeah.
But a lot of kids did sneak in at underage.
Nobody that I remember from school there went in the service before they graduated. The school worked at it, and the parents worked at it, trying to get you through. And then after, of course, you graduate from high school, then you pretty well could decide what you wanted to do. But right after that, after I graduated, then I had signed up for going over to Washington State University. We used to call it Washington State College, of course, and the ROTC. And so went over there in ROTC, and then later I went into the service, and went into what was called V5, which was the Naval Air Corps. And then I spent the rest of the war training, practically training.
So between California and Pullman, how different was the aspect of the war? I mean, you're down by San Francisco and Menlo, meaning that you're out on a coast and fear of attack. Was Pullman less aware of the war, more aware of the war, or was it?
Oh, Pullman, I think, was just aware of the war, of everything. Actually, at Pullman, you had, with ROTC and all that, it was obvious that there were war things going on. And, of course, the radio. We didn't have TV, but we had radio. And then with all the correspondence and what many of the people in school when I was there, of course, they were leaving the school in droves, the fellows particularly. And everybody was hearing from their brothers who were going into the service and all that. So you were very, very aware of it. Not quite the same as you would be if you're right on the coast, I guess, but yeah.
Did they do like blackouts and things like that?
Oh yeah, everything was just, we did that down at Menlo too. Total blackout.
So what did that, I mean, did they ring a bell or how did, or just at nighttime that was it?
That's when the sun went down and everything was covered up and there were no lights on the outside of the buildings. It was that simple.
So did nightlife stop then, or did life go on as normal?
Well, nightlife changed. We did different things. Of course, it made it easier to sneak out of school if you wanted to go into town.
Pluses and minuses to it.
Yes.
So in Pullman, were they facing rationing, or being a college town, was it different over there?
If for rationing, you say?
Yeah, for food and things like that, huh?
It was that I was in a house and all of that was handled through the house. There were special conditions for that. Rationing had probably more exceptions than it had rules that I remember. I don't remember a lot of it because right from Pullman I went basically into the service and then I was there for 4.5 years. And they kept sending me to a different school, and finally I was going to be a flyer, I thought, but then they decided that we were doing pretty well, so they didn't need all the pilots, so they washed about 13,000 guys out in 3 months, and I started over as working up from an apprentice seaman on up, and they kept sending me to a different school. I went to gunnery school and the radar school and to bombardier school, and then we started doing some training in Corpus Christi, and finally our crew was put together with PBMs in San Diego, and we were there just in time for VJ to happen. So
where were you when that happened? I mean,
that happened in San Diego. We were warming up the airplane to go to Oahu and on over to somewhere in the Pacific. And so we warmed our plane up every 20 minutes, and about every 4 hours we put fresh food and stuff aboard, and we kept it fueled up, and we sat in the airplane and we watched what went on in town. VJ Day. It was wild. So that was probably very lucky that we got. And then shortly after that, they busted up the aircrew.
So before you never.
They just said we ain't going to do that anymore. We're through with all that. The war's over, and we're going to change the whole routine. And then shortly thereafter, I was discharged, and I asked to be discharged at Bremerton because that's where I was from. And so they shipped me up there, and I was discharged, and I was out.
So you were basically a wartime enlistee then. So that, meaning that as soon as the war was done.
It took about 2 months to do all the paperwork and all the rest of the stuff to get the guys out and ship them out. But just within 2 months after the war was over, I was out of the service because I was beyond the time that I enlisted for, which was 4 years. It was 4.5 years about that I was in.
Oh, really? Going through all the training?
Yeah, with all the training and everything else, and then when the war was over, I was actually done because that's all my commitment was for. It was just being extended because the war was still on, you know.
So how did you decide when it came time to enlist to finally go ahead and sign up?
Well, I signed up because I wanted to go to Washington State, and I signed up with the Army because that's the only choice I had if I was going to go to Washington State. They had an Army ROTC there. And when I was at Washington State, hadn't been there before the year was out, they came along with what they call the Army-Navy Marine Procurement Board. Or I forget, I think something like that. And they allowed you to make a choice. If you want to go in the Coast Guard, if you want to go in the Marines, you want to go into the Navy. And I said, I wanted to go in the Navy Air Corps. And they said, well, they have a V5 program. Fine. And so I signed up for that, and I was basically transferred to the Navy. And but I left school before I graduated, and when I left school, of course, then I went into the service and started V5. They call it V5. Uh, but it was interesting. I no sooner got home and I found there was something there at my house in Olympia, my folks' house in Olympia for me, and I opened it up, and it was a discharge from the Army, because they actually discharged me for about 6 months of duty in the ROTC. So I was already a veteran.
So that's
So to speak.
double discharge then.
Yeah.
You have discharge from both the Army and
Yeah.
Huh. Well, so one thing you talked about was at Pullman, you said they were leaving in droves. So when you got to Pullman, was it not too many men left over there?
When I went to Pullman, there was still quite a few young guys going to school, but most of the old fellows had well, if they're in ROTC and they're still in school and they're working, they probably were there. But many of the guys would leave school, and they would just volunteer for one of the other services or one of the services and go. And a number of them that were in school were just waiting to be called. They'd volunteered, they were in the service, they were in school, and they were just waiting for the time that they said, go. And anybody who has graduated from college or was nearly graduated from college, most of those guys in the early part of the war could go in and would go in with a rank as an officer. But I spent most of my time in training.
So different, like your brothers over at the fraternity or different classmates that had gone into active service before you, there was correspondence coming back to the college to people? Were they getting letters from?
We had some of that from the guys who were really good friends, but most of the correspondence, I think, from any guy that went to service was with their immediate family. Yeah, but yeah, everybody was worried about the war, what was going to happen, and what was going to happen to them personally, of course. And I don't have any regrets. I was at 17 different bases in the United States, only one overseas out of Coca-Cola, Panama. And I wouldn't say I enjoyed everything, but it was very interesting.
So the guys that as you were signing up and your other buddies at college and stuff like that were getting signed up, did you discuss the possibilities of war, or did you kind of disassociate?
No, that was the topic of the day. And every day listening and wondering how we're doing. Of course, at the early days there, it didn't look very good. In fact, it was probably everybody was more pessimistic than they really needed to be. But it was a natural tendency. But you were affected so much with everything on a daily basis, because you had, like you say, the windows were covered and all the rest of the stuff. You didn't spend the time to uncover them during the day because it's too damn hard to tighten them up at night. Or you have a little leak, and then the civilian guard would come along and rap on your window or rap on your door and tell you got to cover the stuff. And so it was constantly you talked about the war, thought about the war, thought about going, thought about those things you heard about people who got killed, friends and relatives and all of that. It was a worrisome thing.
Did that dissuade you at all whether to enlist or not to enlist?
No. No, you mean whether you should join or not join? No, I think to me, most of the fellows that I knew, it was the other way around. You wanted to do the best job you could, but you also wanted to get the best sort of berth you could get. Yeah, and that's why some people chose the Army and some people chose the Navy. And in the Navy, of course, you had several different choices, just like you had in the Army, Some guys just loved to be in the tanks. That wouldn't impress me too much, but Neither would submarines.
Did you lose any friends in the war? Did you lose any friends?
Oh yeah, quite a number. Actually, I lost a lot of my schoolmates from my high school, both here in Olympia and the ones that were with me down in Menlo. Yeah, and quite a few of them were lost fairly early in the war, and of course, a lot of my friends were injured during the war, one way or another. Yeah.
Did when you were in training, were they giving you all sorts of propaganda? I guess propaganda wasn't the word they used then, but
you didn't have. I wouldn't call it propaganda. You wanted all the information you could get, anything that was available, either written or radio. Constantly listening to the radios, because the war news was the most important thing. And you know, in those early days when we weren't doing too good, that wasn't very good news. But I don't remember any of my friends ever changing their mode of thinking about what their real job was. Their job was to do what you could for the United States. To hell with the rest of those bastards.
And there weren't very many people that questioned that.
Not that within my realm of friends and relationships and where I was and working and everything. No.
Now you had been to Germany.
I was in Germany in '39, and we ran from Naples with my dad and my father and my mother and father and my brother, one of my brothers. We drove through Europe. We drove up to Italy, and we went into Brenner Pass, and we stayed in a hotel in Innsbruck. And the next morning, I was awakened, or we were all awakened, to noises and drums and beatings, and it was May Day in Germany in 1939. And out of the window of the hotel, we saw the Jungfrau in the black shirts and the brown shirts and the green shirts. And they were all marching. And then everywhere we went in Germany, we saw troop movements and things. And when we came home, my father wrote and told everybody he could, wrote to the federal government and all saying there's a war coming. Of course, that was the same time when we didn't think the war was coming. It sounded like things were getting organized diplomatically. Yeah, so it was a scary time.
Now, didn't you hear Hitler over the? Did you hear Hitler?
Oh well,
I mean,
he had
over
every town had microphone or speakers rather, public speakers, like on a post, and it would be all around town. And when Hitler spoke, nothing moved. They basically shut down business. And he would talk for hours. And it would go on and on and on. And that really was very impressive on a 16-year-old kid. It's hard to explain. If you've seen the movie Winds of War, the first section of that, when I saw that, that was exactly what we saw when we were there in '39. But we saw, troop movements on rail cars with guns and tanks and people in uniforms and everything else. It was very interesting.
In retrospect, when the war started, when Germany was involved in the war, having heard Hitler speak, did you realize, you think more so than other people, what power Hitler had?
Oh yes, because my brothers and my mother and father went to Switzerland, and I stayed with a shirt-tail relative aunt in Worms, and we spent a lot of time talking about when Hitler came to power, the things that happened, and her son, whom I met, was in the Luftwaffe. They had a little farm and a brickyard, and so I worked on the farm while they were gone. I just lived like a farmer, got up early and they used to scrub the hogs every morning with a big stiff brush. They loved that. But anyway, so I heard it from an entirely different aspect of when he came to power, how things had changed quickly and how things were getting better and all that, up until a point later on when things started going the other way. And at that point, they were beginning to think things weren't too good. Yeah.
So when you enlisted and thought of the war, was the war against the Japanese, or was it against, in your mind, against the Japanese and the Germans and?
Well, it was basically against the Japanese because that's who attacked us. But then, it didn't take much movement to where we began to join in with England and Europe to go against Hitler. We'd already been sending, you remember, all the war supplies and things to Russia and to England and everybody. But so it was those damn Germans and Japanese.
Did you have had the internment camps already been started by the time you went to Poland?
The Japanese?
Yeah.
It was when I was there. It was just starting.
So were there some Japanese American students over there with you?
I don't really remember for sure. That's interesting when you ask me that. If there were Japanese students, there weren't very many Japanese students. There weren't very many Oriental students at all at Washington State.
Do you remember? I mean, did they make a thing of it in the news when the internment happened? Or was that something you were kind of unaware of?
What's that?
Like the Puyallup Fairgrounds, and were you aware that was?
No, I wasn't really aware of it. The information about the war, the news about the war was so prominent. Sure, there were things about it, but it was a big thing, the rounding up of the Japanese and moving them out. There was only one, in Olympia, there was only one Japanese person about my age that I really knew. There were a number of Chinese I knew, but only one Japanese person.
Huh. Do you know if he ended up in the?
I have no idea.
Huh.
I have no idea. They were a family that worked in the oyster business here.
Oh,
Yeah.
I might even know who that is. How did it? Now you were out of town, but how did it, in correspondence with like your mom and your dad? How did this affect business?
My business. I mean,
the brewery.
Well, the brewery. Excuse me. In the brewery business, much of the things the brewery used were also were needed for the war effort because of the grains. And so what the brewery did during World War II was cut back on their production to keep the quality up, and so pulled basically mostly out of California. So from that standpoint, it affected the brewery. But they continued to produce beer and produce a high-quality beer, and we're making good profits during the time. Also began making and shipping beer for the service, the 3-2 beer. And
What's 3-2 beer?
Well, the normal beer is 3.6% by weight. And the service requires that the beer be only 3.2%. Some states require that. And so all the military beer, as it was called, was 3.2. And because of the location of Olympia, that in the South Pacific, when we're getting towards the end of the war, that much of the beer was sent to the services in all through the Asian theater. And then also they began shipping to distributors as after the war was over into the Asian area. So Olympia was one of the very first beers into South Pacific, introduced to a lot of people through that, of course. Yeah.
Did the government require things of the companies then, businesses? Did they, or was it just because of short demand that they changed the way they?
Well, for the service beer, they require special packaging with special markings and all that stuff, all very military. But no, I don't know that they had any really specific requirements just about operating the business. The amount of material they got and the kind of material they got was affected by the government indirectly.
You want a cup of water?
Let's hold a second, I'll get up.
Here. What was happening with, like, so your mom and dad were the only ones back at home, all the boys were gone, and
Well, not really all gone. My brother Bink, he went into service. He was a warrant officer. He was stationed at Kodiak at the time to begin with. But Bobby and Bump were both here. And they were here throughout the war. And then I was, and my sister, of course, but then I was gone most of the time after I finished up over Pullman and went into the service. In fact, I only came home, I guess, 3 times in all that, the whole war. Sometimes I was so far away that a short leave it wasn't worth coming all the way back. And it seemed like everywhere I went, I would meet people and families and stuff, and got to know people all over the United States.
And during World War II, being in a uniform was kind of like a key.
Made the hitchhiking pretty easy.
Was there a lot of that?
Hitchhiking? Oh, yeah, that was a major form of transportation. And for me, maybe as much as any other thing, because you didn't have a car, there was no car available. Couldn't afford one, even if you couldn't buy one, even if you could afford it, because they were a short ration. And so it was a great way to go. If you were in San Diego and you wanted to go to Los Angeles, you could get the bus, or you could get out on the highway and start hitchhiking. And that was a 3-lane highway. But yeah, you could get rides quite easily.
Did you tend to wear your uniform all the time then?
You had to wear a uniform when you went ashore. You couldn't go ashore in civilian clothes.
Oh, you couldn't?
Oh, no. No. You're in the service.
Not even when you were on leave?
I don't know. I didn't know. I didn't have any. We didn't have any civilian clothes with us whatsoever. Yeah.
Huh. So the fact that you were in uniform had some advantages, I assume.
Yes. It had some great advantages when you're going around town. It's had some disadvantages too, because a lot of people were not overly crazy about too many servicemen. And in fact, that's one of the things we did in San Diego, because there was Army, Navy, and Marines all over San Diego. The guys I was billeted with, we would go out in the town, and what we'd do is we'd go out into the hills looking for a little family restaurant somewhere. We'd find one of those, and at first we'd have a tough time getting them to even seat us, and then once we got in, we'd get to know them, we'd have a great time. Yeah, so if you get too many in one spot, it's difficult. But being in uniform, there is an advantage, during the war anyway.
I assume then, yeah, because of the patriotism, that people were willing to do whatever they could for the people.
They were just wonderful. Everybody, everywhere I went, everybody was just great. And except when you had too many at one time. You know, if you had 20 guys walking down the street together, all in uniform, people were very hesitant about doing anything with them. But onesies and twosies was just no problem at all.
You've told a story before about being in uniform and the advantages sometimes, like with gas rationing. Seems like you came home one time.
Oh, well.
Tell me about gas rationing and then the advantage of uniform.
Well, one leave when I came home, my dad reluctantly was going to let me take the car so that I and some of my buddies could go do something. I forget what it was, and he gave me gas stamps just enough so I could get 5 gallons of gas. And this was the Lincoln Zephyr. And so I pulled into Hank Bolliner's 76 station downtown, and he'd been around for a million years. And so I gave him the coupons and told him to give me 5 gallons of gas. He started pumping, and while he was pumping, he was talking to me through the window, and he kept going. And pretty soon I realized he was pumping too much gas, and I said, I hollered at him, he's pumping too much gas. And he ignored me and went ahead and filled the tank up. And I said, Hank, you're going to get in trouble with the government. You can't just do that. You're only authorized for 5 gallons. Oh, he said, the boys in uniforms, he said, I take care of them. He said, besides, I get a lot of evaporation from my tanks. You're a great guy.
So, and I assume there was a lot of that for the.
I would think so.
For the people in uniform. That,
Yeah.
Is it true? I mean, you read it in the history books, but was there this sense once the war turned around and they saw that America was on the aggressive rather than defensive, there truly was this unifying of the country?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, sure. There are people who work the system, but I don't care what's going on. Somebody's going to try to work the system no matter what. But yeah, no, there certainly was a unification, and but you were talking about what extra things that people did when hitchhiking. You know, the first thing when you get in the car, you go, where are you going? Well, I'm going to Los Angeles. And they get going pretty soon. The guy said, well, I'm only going to go to so-and-so. And I said, fine. And all of a sudden we passed where he told me he was going to turn off. And he said, well, just, a couple more miles and there's another way I can get back easily. They're just awful nice people everywhere I went.
And do you think was that because of the war, or was that because was that a change to a certain extent from America pre-war to America during the war?
Oh, I think that pre-war and during the war, that definitely was a change, because you didn't pay much attention to people in uniform prior to. It was all part of the whole thing pulled together. I think it certainly had a lot to do with it.
Did it make a difference, Navy, Army, Marine, which uniform you were in?
I don't think it made much difference. And the other thing is that I seldom heard of anybody who was picked a person in uniform up having any trouble with the person in uniform. Now, maybe there was some, but I didn't ever see it. I'm sure there was somewhere along the line, but
what's the biggest thing that you, and I might know the answer to this, Ken and I were just talking about this, about different things people learn in different situations. And I know you've told me something that you learned in the Navy one time, and it had to do with having to wait around a lot. What's one of the biggest things you learned in the Navy?
Straighten up that line or none of you will eat. Lines after lines after lines. But there's just so many things, so many times when there's nothing, absolutely nothing to do except, if you're on a plane or you're working with a plane, lots of little things you do to keep yourself busy, polishing and fixing things up and straightening stuff up. but there were lots of times when you just didn't have hardly anything to do. And so you learned to be able to nap almost anywhere. I did. But, and then you start to do things, you know. I always carried a penknife, and so I discovered that down in San Diego that the mop handles were pretty good to carve, and so I was carving things out of mop handles, and the mops would be a little shorter after I got pieces cut off the top, but they still worked.
Now coming in at the kind of the tail end of the war as you're going through training and all that, I assume that discipline had changed and a lot of people were over serving and some people were over here. Within this freedom, or within this, like you talked about free time that you had waiting, did that leave a lot of chance for people within the service to kind of screw off, or was everybody so focused on?
Oh, a screw off is a screw off. And they screwed off no matter when it was in the war. I don't think there was too much just general screw off unless it was just you didn't have anything to do at all. You would just sit around and wait, but you're waiting for somebody to tell you what to do next. But the basic difference is that the more used you got to the service, the more you learned about everything, the easier it is for each person. You don't have to worry so much. It's so routine. You eat at the same time, you go to bed at the same time, you get up at the same time. And of course, if you're on special shifting, which we were in some cases, then you might be on 8 on and 8 off. But it is pretty routine. And there are things for you to do on base if you'd ever want to leave base, because you not only had movies, but you had live entertainment. So you got to see, particularly bases in the United States, you got to see almost every big band, every great entertainer that, if you were lucky, and if the show wasn't when you were on duty, of course.
Who were some of the...
Well, when I was stationed at Norman, Oklahoma, the base band was Tex Beneke and the Glenn Miller band. It was just after Glenn Miller was killed, but he was the base band, which is pretty nice.
Was that part of the USO? Or was that just military?
I don't know how they got there. They were in the service. I believe they were in the service, but they were the base band.
Huh.
Yeah.
What did you see some of the movies, Catch-22 and all that? Again, as the service went along and the war was tailing down, where protocol got a little looser. Did that change, or was the regiment and the military procedure?
It changed with the. I can speak for myself. It changed with the fellows coming back from the South Pacific into the bases where I was stationed in San Diego and around. They were very relaxed coming back, and most of that had to do with started from the top down. That the admirals would be more relaxed, and they'd let the men be more relaxed because they're out there fighting a damn war. And so, many things happened. Ties disappeared. Guys would come back with long hair. If you're in the China Seas, you'd have a gold earring in your ear. All kinds of different things that before, I used to, because I was pretty good with a pair of scissors, I used to trim guys' hair to get past inspection so they didn't have to go get the GI down to the Navy barber. People didn't worry so much about some of those details after that.
So were the people coming back from the South Pacific, were they on a leave or ending their...
No, they're just coming back. They're just coming back and would be stationed in San Diego, and they would arrive with their uniforms in not the greatest shape and their hair long and very relaxed. Their cap was crushed and,
Did they intermingle with...
everybody, yeah.
So when you met these people, were they coming and relating horror stories, or did they not?
Oh, most of them didn't talk much about, a little bit. They talked about the things that were humorous. The humorous things now, the thing I remember mostly are a lot of the humor. A lot of the bad stuff is just washed away. I know I told you that we got 13,000 guys in V5 got washed out at one time, and I was in the first washout cadet company that went to Great Lakes to start over as apprentice seaman. Well, if you were in the Marines and wanted to be a naval pilot or a Marine pilot, you were trained by the Navy. So 2 of the guys in this first company were ex-Marines who had been on Guadalcanal and were now apprentice seamen. Now, they weren't overly happy. But we got talking about what it was, and everybody said, well, we got screwed. We got the flying screws, what they kept saying, the flying screw. So I had a great idea one day. I took this, was a notebook, and I took off, there was a vinyl cover, a plastic cover, and I took that off the back, and I made a little stencil with wings and a flying screw on a slant in the middle of it. And we stenciled our dungaree uniforms. And before we got out of Great Lakes, I'd made about 3 more stencils. And we'd keep seeing this wherever we go. We'd see a guy with the flying screw wings and everything. Oh, you're back at Great Lakes. Oh, how'd you know? So you remember those things. And the guys that came back from the service, they came back from, let's say, the Asian theater, they came back, they talked about some of the bad things, but they talked about a lot of the fun things. And I don't know, I think that it's, those hours that you waited and all the times that you were really upset, you don't remember those. I don't remember those anyway. I think that the good times, the friends you made, some of the wonderful things you saw. But of course, there I was, 4.5 years, and the only naval ship I ever went on was because I ran into 3 guys I grew up with in Olympia that wanted me to go with them, and I walked up the gangplank on the ship that they were on, and then I walked back off, and that's the only ship I was on in 4.5 years.
In the Navy.
We're in the Navy, yeah.
Did the guys that came back, when you saw them, I mean, did you see a difference in them, or was, because I've heard some say...
I mean, the guys that just came back from the Asian theater, because that's who mostly we saw. And they look different. Immediately they look different. Well, of course, they were tan, number one, if they were in that area. But there was just a total difference about them. Just the way they moved, it was...
But they didn't have the attitude, we're going to come and tell all these young bucks what it's really like
No,
over there.
no. They were just old salts, They'd wrung more salt water out of their socks than we'd ever seen. But other than that, no, they really were very good. Yeah. But there was definitely, you would see one walking across the base and you would know immediately he'd just gotten back. It was that obvious. Yeah.
Did you gain an animosity towards, when you looked at the war, was the war against a country or a person or people, or what was the war to you?
To me, the war was against the country. Or perhaps, maybe a better way to put it, the war against the power of the country. Because, I knew that the German people weren't what the Nazis were, or Hitler was. I didn't know about Japan, but I just couldn't believe that that the Japanese people were different, but I wasn't sure about this Mitsubishi and some of those names really, now we're driving the cars. Yeah, but you also had admiration. I was after V5, then I went to school as an ordnanceman.
Well, that thought I was. Okay, so.
You were asking about animosity.
Yeah, animosity.
Not towards an individual, and but you also learned through things. Like I started to say, my training was in ordnance. After V5, I became an ordnanceman, and I had a ball. I loved it. We got to fire probably almost every of the enemy's weapons when I was at Norman, Oklahoma. And I loved working with the guns and the bombs and the whole business. But you admired the work that, particularly the Germans, beautifully machined guns, equipment, armament. The Americans' Americans were better because we produced a whole lot more. You learned as the time went by. The Japanese guns, the ones that we saw, were very good, efficient, but they weren't of the caliber that ours was or the Germans were. Yeah, Italians made some pretty good stuff. But again, going back, because I was still connected with the air arm of the Navy, that was the other thing we got to see, was most of the, at least one of many of the different planes that were made by the Germans and the Japanese. And you really had to admire particularly the Zero was a hell of a nice little plane. It wasn't very heavy, protected with for the pilot, but it was just a beautifully built plane. The German planes were excellent, Messerschmitt and all that. But yeah, I don't. It was animosity, you know. It was those goddamn Krauts and those goddamn Japanese, or Japs, as you used to call them. But on a person-to-person basis, I don't think that there was an animosity. Now, I'm not saying that if you were a prisoner of war in either Japan or Germany or somewhere, that would be a different situation. I never was, so I never saw that.
Why do you think that the U.S. chose to enter Japanese citizens? I mean, if your name had been Hashimoto or something of that sort, but being Schmidt, being a German,
I don't know how. Well, let me go back a little bit. My father and my mother told me how difficult it was during World War I, being a German of German descent in the United States at the time, and all the rest of that stuff. How and why the United States decided to intern all the Japanese, I don't know how they came to that conclusion, other than just hysteria. And I don't know, how they really arrived at it and how they decided to do it. And boy, it was really organized. But it just was a travesty. But I'll tell you this, the Japanese that I have known and know who were interned seem to have an attitude that, they lost so much, but the attitude of, well, we just have to pick up the marbles and go back to work. But no, I don't know how we came to that. It was really a bum move.
When you came back from World War II, were there many Japanese American citizens in Olympia?
No. Primarily because there wasn't before. Yeah, there were more in the Seattle area.
Was there a dislike for Japanese product that you know of?
Not after Not after the Americans went over there and helped them get going again. Yeah, with I think there probably was both American and Japanese and German, but that was just a passing thing, you know. You're going to buy something, if you're looking for something cheap, or if you're looking for something quality, whoever has the quality or the cheap that you're looking for is probably where you're going to buy it. And you're not going to, generally, are not going to do it just on a nationality thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the imbalance we have in trade now. Yeah. But no, I'm sure that there are some people who say they would never buy something from the made in Japan or something made in Germany, but maybe there's some that don't like the Italian very well.
How does a Navy, a seaman, what's a good way to, what's some Yank ingenuity in cooling down beer?
What was that?
What is some Yank ingenuity that was used to ice some beer when you needed a cold beer or something like that? What were some of the ways?
Oh, well, there was a simple way to do it if you didn't mind a little bit of taste of gasoline. You know, when you're fueling up the plane, if you had a sock and a can of beer and you just put a little bit of the 130 or 180 octane, whatever your fuel was, put that on the sack and whirl that around your head a few times, you'd be surprised how quickly that cools that beer down. It also, when you open it, it spurts a little more than usual, but it's yeah. Yeah, well, it was just all kinds of things. And in San Diego, of course, you're just hanging over the edge into the water. We didn't have beer aboard the plane, but on the PBM we had 2-burner electric stove, and we had two warming ovens that were in the stove, and we always used one of the warming ovens for a refrigerator because the butter would melt. So we'd take a CO2 extinguisher and put the butter in one of the deals, squirt that in there, and then that would stay, if we were flying about 10 or 12 hours, that'd stay pretty good shape most of the time because the warming oven was insulated. So it worked the same way with the freezing. Oh, there was all kinds of ingenious things that the Swabbies would come up with.
Now didn't one of the gentlemen in your in the Navy with you or in somewhere in your group want a burial by air or something like that?
Oh, well, that was at San Diego. We were patrolling the West Coast, is what our job was with the PBMs. We also did a lot of air search rescue. And where we'd go out, we'd fly for 12 or 14 hours just looking at the ocean, looking for somebody on patterns and things like that. And we were at a PBM, and they have 2 waste hatches that opened up. And one of the squadron's planes had gone down, and all were lost. But one of the crew, I think it was the skipper of the plane, in his will wanted to have his ashes spread on the ocean. So somebody came up with a bright idea that they would go up in the PBM, and they'd open the waste hatch, and they would the priest or the minister would spread the ashes out of the waste hatch. And so our plane got the duty, and we went up. We got up. We were out off of San Diego, ways out in the ocean, and opened the waste hatch, and the guy gave the little talk and everything, and finally then opened up the ashes and was dumping them out the window. Well, it's interesting in a plane that the wind swirls in and out, and the ashes were going outside, but the ashes were coming inside and going all over. We had dust all over hell. But it wasn't funny at the time, but after we landed and we're cleaning up and everything, and a few days went, it became funnier. It was not funny because the wife was there in the plane with us, and a couple other people. But in a way, it's a little humorous.
Yeah.
But those things happen all the time.
Huh.
I think the most humorous, if you know, you can go on with these dumb stories, but on a PBM, when you use depth charges, you would take the depth charge, there was a screw hole, a thread in it, and you put an eye-ring in there, and then you would hoist it up. You have a little hoist, take it up, it would go in the cell just behind the engines, and it would go on a shackle. And there was an old chief that was introducing some new kids to what goes on in the Navy, new recruits. And it wasn't our plane, it was one down the line on a tarmac. And they started this up, and we saw the depth charge was turning. And I said, being the ordnanceman, I said, you know, I'm not so sure, but I think that thing is unscrewing. And so they were talking and going on and on up. And the chief was talking about how they were going in. And just before it got up to the cell, it dropped. And I swear that before it hit the ground, all of those kids who were watching that were at least 40 feet away. It just went down, boom, crunch, and then flattened on one side. The fuse wasn't armed, so that probably nothing would have ever gone wrong. But it was quite a thrill for him. Yeah. Okay.
Do you think
Quit reminding me of stories.
do you think that there's a message from World War II for future generations?
Oh, I think so. I don't know about what perhaps that the country acted as one for all those years, in a way, in a sense. And the responsibility that all these guys had before and after the war, that I don't know how to put it, but maybe just a unification of sort of thinking, because you did have, you know, one thing: we're going to finish off the Germans, we're going to finish off the Japanese, and we were going to not have any more wars, if I recall. We've had a few since then, and we made a few more mistakes. I'll say one thing: in World War II, that basically our generals and admirals didn't make very many mistakes. They took a hell of a lot of chances, and they asked the guys, and they ask, I think, is more than forcing. They asked the guys to do their jobs, and most of the guys did their jobs to the best of their ability, even with all the boredom. Yeah.
You were pretty young, but did you, from when you were in high school and then after the war, I mean, could you see a difference in the country?
Uh-huh. I could. Of course, I was not really in business before the war. I worked. I worked every summer, every time I was not going to school. But yeah, I saw a number of differences. But I think maybe after the war that people began to question things more, question the governments about things that you never would have done during the war. But I don't know whether that has anything to do with anything.
Did it leave you more patriotic after the war?
More what?
More patriotic?
More patriotic? That's kind of hard to be more patriotic after the war than you were during the war. But more patriotic in a different sense. I was more concerned about what we were doing with our government. But part of that would be just getting older, I think. More concerned about our local governments. Yeah, I think maybe that the big change for me probably was how I thought about government and what government does and how it operates and how it handles things. And I say it's really people or some people in government. And my basic attitude, philosophic attitude as far as politics has changed. And part of it came about because of just my experiences during the war. But a lot of it came about just because I got more involved in things than I had been before.
But you think that's some of where you got your interest in the government was from your experience in the war?
Well, I would say so, because I questioned in my own mind how some of the things ran in the Navy, but I questioned some of the things were running that were not in the Navy but were involved in the war effort, how they came and went, and yeah, I don't know. I think maybe that had some effect, but what I saw in '39 when they were in Germany, and that had some effect on. I know I didn't want to have anything to do with anybody who was going to dictate to me what I was supposed to think and do. And that's gotten stronger as time has gone by.
When you were on leave or at home, was the war discussion with you and your dad, was that a dinner discussion or not?
He was too damn busy that period of time, and I was gone. I was gone in school. And when I was home, like in the summer, then I would be working. I worked. It was kind of an undocumented law in our family that you get a job right away when school's out. In fact, my father would, after about 3 days, my father would always ask if you got a job yet. And I knew if I didn't get a job, he was going to put me to work, and I didn't get paid nothing. So I worked. But yeah, we discussed a lot of things, but not my father and his sons, my 3 brothers, myself. I don't think that you spent much time in discussing that sort of thing. You discussed business, you discussed how you're going to get the house clean or the boat fixed up or the screens off the windows and washed and put away, and he was gone. He was on the road. So he'd be gone 2 or 3 weeks at a time, because his job was in overseeing and selling. So he was gone when I was growing up an awful lot.
So you didn't hear his views on Hitler or?
Oh yeah, I heard a lot of that, because every time we'd have company, my dad would give him this was before the war started, would give him the full treatment on what we saw over there. And many people couldn't understand how he could be saying that about, he was born here, he was born in Montana, but you know, some of them felt a little strange, I think, that he was talking down Germany so badly. Yeah.
Being a German. I mean, being an American, but with a German heritage.
Yeah, and, you know, naturally, you talk about the Japanese, well, you know, immediately everybody thought the Japanese was all spies, like we did at Menlo. That janitor definitely was a spy, and we knew he had a transmitting radio underneath his bed, just because he was a Japanese janitor.
One thing I forgot, because it just reminded me, and I'm not sure if I have this story right, but didn't your mom, in your house, didn't she do a wartime effort? It seemed like that room downstairs that she entertained soldiers, or not?
Oh, she did a lot of things. She did an awful lot of things during the war. Of course, most of it I wasn't there, so I wasn't really involved in. Like I told you, that once I went into the service, I would be home for, you know, maybe 6 days at a time, maybe 10 days at a time. By the time you get through all the travel and moving back and forth, you didn't have too much time. So I saw very little. Yes, my mother and the Navy, what was a Navy, not a Navy club, a Navy organization met in the basement all through the war. Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know why I remember
my father, if you recall, had this wonderful new yacht. He had just finished in early '39, and he turned that over to the government, and the Coast Guard had it all through the war, and they had machine gun mount on the foredeck, and they used it for all kinds of things, including entertaining high mucky mucks who would come up from Washington D.C. for some reason, like the head of the Navy Department or something. That would be the the Queen ship that they would cruise Puget Sound with, and yeah, and he got it back after the war, but he just turned the whole thing over to the government.
And that was not by request. That was just something.
No, he offered it. He said it's a new boat, it's a good shape, and this is what you want. I don't want anything for it. You take it, you use it. Just keep good care of it and give it back to me in as good a condition as possible at the end of the war. That was just the kind of thing he did.
And they mounted guns on it and patrolled.
Parts of Puget Sound, yeah. No, it wasn't down here. It was stationed in Seattle, yeah. But it cruised all over because it was a great boat to take people out and show them. You know, people come. You could go in and you see Bremerton from the water, and you can see. Well, they didn't have Bangor then, but all the rest of the stuff, and but it was a Coast Guard boat. It was painted gray. It was a beautiful white boat, but it was painted that wonderful gray that all Navy ships and Coast Guard ships were painted. Yeah.
Was that common? I mean, did they have a number of vessels like that?
Quite a few people donated vessels, but I believe that was the biggest one.
Huh.
It was 53'2" at the waterline. So it was a big boat.
Yeah, compared to a destroyer escort, though, not very big.
Hmm?
Compared to a destroyer or an escort, not very big.
No. But it was a boat. We used to say that a boat is a vessel you can lift onto a ship. So when you say boat, it's a boat. Yeah.
Well, great.